At roughly 1:30 p.m. on 28th of August 2003, Tony Dickmo answered the phone at Mamma Mia's Pizzeria in Pennsylvania. Unable to understand the person on the other end of the phone, Tony would pass the phone to another member of staff, who would scribble down the address and order on a piece of paper. A few hours later, that man was being broadcast on live news all over the world. And years later, this story would be told in a Netflix documentary. That man's name was Brian Wells, and this is the case of the infamous pizza bomber. But before we deep dive into this story, please tap the like button, hit the notification bell, and subscribe to this channel for a feast of grim and grisly content. I am your host, Severed Soul. Born on November 15th in 1956 in Warren, Pennsylvania, Brian Wells was one of 5 children born to Harold and Rose Wells. Harold Wells was a Korean War veteran who suffered with multiple sclerosis later on in life. This led to Brian dropping out of Erie's East High School in his sophomore year in 1973, aged 16. Teachers at Brian's school would say that he was an intelligent but somewhat troubled individual. When Brian left school, he started training as a mechanic. However, this wouldn't last long, and he ended up working as a pizza delivery driver. At the age of 33, Brian received the devastating news that his father, Harold Wells, had died due to complications caused by his multiple sclerosis. Harold was 60 years old at the time of his death. Not long after his father's passing, Brian found himself in trouble with law for the first time. After a confrontation with the neighbour, Brian was arrested and charged, but he pleaded guilty in court. To make matters worse, Brian threatened to shoot a magistrate. By 2003, Brian had spent 30 years working as a pizza delivery driver, spending 10 of those 30 years working for Mamma Mia's Pizza in Pennsylvania. In his spare time, Brian enjoyed completing jigsaw puzzles, practicing his guitar, and looking after his 3 cats who he absolutely adored. He spent the rest of his time building his car from spare parts, and every year Brian would take part in a local competition known as the Great Key Hunt. Readers of the local newspaper would decipher clues, which would lead them to keys, and ultimately to a box containing $2,500 in cash. Other than his cats, Brian lived alone and battled with alcohol and substance abuse. He craved a partner and desperately wanted a family of his own. Unfortunately, this was never to be the case. Brian's neighbours would describe him as being very nice and friendly, laid back and quiet, but always polite and almost childlike in nature. Linda Payne, Brian's landlady, described Brian as the perfect tenant. The property was always kept clean, tidy and minimalist, and rent was always paid on time. Brian would also often help Linda out with DIY jobs and chores around the house. His morning routine often consisted of having breakfast at McDonald's whilst reading the newspaper, before his shift started at Mamma Mia's Pizzas at 11 a.m. On 28th of August 2003, Brian had made plans to visit his mother, watch a movie and eat pizza once his shift finished at Mamma Mia's Pizza at 2 p.m. At some time between 1:15 p.m. and 1:30 p.m. that day, Tony Dickmo, the owner of Mamma Mia's Pizza, would answer a phone call from a customer. Unable to understand the muffled voice of the caller, Tony passed the phone over to Brian, who would write down an address and an order of 2 sausage and pepperoni pizzas. The delivery address was 8631 Peach Street, a clearing near a transmission tower of local radio station WSTE-TV, located at the end of a dirt road 3.5 miles down Peach Street. Brian made his delivery, bringing his shift to an end. He got back in his car and made his way back down the dirt road before heading into the car park of the local PNC Bank. At 2:27 p.m, CCTV footage at the PNC Bank showed Brian Wells walking into the bank with a walking cane. Brian was balding, with thin tufts of grey hair around the side of his head, and glasses with large square lenses in the frame. He was wearing a white t-shirt with a large Guess logo on the front of it. However, something didn't look quite right about Brian's t-shirt. There was quite obviously something very bulky concealed underneath Brian's shirt. And considering the events that were about to unfold, Brian's demeanour was unusually calm. Without any expression on his face whatsoever, Brian approached the teller behind the desk and handed her a folded up bunch of notes. The teller unfolded the notes and read them to herself with an expression of great concern on her face. The note read, "Gather employees with access code to vault and work hard to fill bag with $250,000. You have only 15 minutes. Act now, think later, or you will die." As the teller inspected the note, Brian requested to see the manager, who just happened to be out at lunch at the present moment and wasn't due back at the bank for another half an hour. At this point, Brian lifted his shirt to expose the full magnitude of the situation. Concealed under Brian's shirt was an electronic device secured in place by a metal collar. The box on the device had a series of locks on it, and the teller knew instantly that this was a bomb. Brian then lifted his walking cane to reveal that this was no ordinary walking cane. This was a makeshift shotgun with a curved handle to imitate a walking cane. This was a makeshift shotgun with a curved handle designed to imitate a walking cane. In a panic, the teller explained to Brian that the request written down on the notes would not be possible to fulfill. There was no way of gaining access to the vault until the manager was present. She gathered as much cash as she possibly could and stuffed it all into Brian's canvas bag. She gathered as much cash as she possibly could from all the drawers and stuffed all the money into Brian's canvas bag. At this point, another customer entered the bank and the teller signalled over for the customer to call 911. Seemingly unfazed by this, Brian secured his bag and started to walk towards the exit. At 2:38 p.m, Brian was filmed on CCTV making his way out of the bank. But before leaving the bank, grabbed a lollipop out of a basket, casually unwrapped it and placed it into his mouth. Brian left the bank that day with a grand total of $8,702. Upon leaving the bank, Brian was observed by another customer climbing into his car, then picking up another pile of papers. Brian carefully read the instructions on the papers before folding them up and placing them on the seat next to him. He then started his engine and drove away. By this time, 3 separate calls had been placed to the police reporting the incident. Pennsylvania police had been dispatched by 2:40 p.m. Brian pulled onto the main road before heading to Summit Town Centre, where he entered the McDonald's car park and found a place to park his car. He got out of his car and made his way towards the large McDonald's drive-through sign, where there was a garden bed. Brian reached into the garden bed and pulled out a rock from the soil. Taped to the bottom of the rock was another note. Brian removed the note from the rock, read it, then promptly got back into his car and made the short journey around to the car park of Eyeglass World. At 2:49 p.m, State Troopers Victoria Weibel and Chris Stafford arrived on the scene. The State Troopers apprehended Brian, handcuffing his hands behind his back, then demanding that he get down on his knees. Backup started to arrive, and Brian's demeanour started to shift. He was becoming visibly more anxious and agitated. Brian was communicating with the State Troopers in a shaky, high-pitched voice. He was trying to explain to the troopers that he had an explosive device secured around his neck, and that he didn't have much time. They needed to take action soon. Officer Weibel made a phone call to the bomb squad and to the director of the Erie FBI. It was now 3:04 p.m, 32 minutes after the initial 911 call to police had been made, and 15 minutes after the State Troopers had apprehended Brian on the car park. Brian informed the police officers that he was a pizza delivery guy local to the area. He said he'd been delivering pizzas by the TV tower when he was ambushed by 3 black men as he made his way up the dirt road. He said he was knocked to the ground during a scuffle with the men when one of them drew a gun and fired a warning shot into the air. Before he knew it, he was being manhandled and had an unknown contraption secured around his neck. Brian said one of the men handed him a stack of notes with a series of instructions written on them. He claimed he was told if he wasn't compliant and didn't follow the instructions, then he would be killed. The notes appeared to be directing Brian on some kind of treasure hunt. Brian would be sent to a specific location where he would complete a given task to find a key. If he retrieved the keys within the time specified, he could use them to unlock the device and avoid otherwise certain death. The first quest written on the notes was, of course, the PNC bank heist. So Brian continued to explain to the troopers that the device around his neck was a bomb, and that the walking cane that he'd been provided with was a shotgun. He'd been given the cane to use at the bank if the staff were unwilling to cooperate. Brian explained that he was under close surveillance from the three men to ensure that he was closely following every instruction on the notes and that he completed all the tasks. The troopers were well aware that reports involving bombs and explosive devices were fairly common. However, they usually turned out to be hoaxes. One of the officers at the scene, James Szymanski, decided to use a knife to slice through Brian's t-shirt to expose the device. He removed the shirt to reveal a metal collar around Brian's neck which had a metal box hanging from it. Mounted sideways on the lower corner of the box was a white, digital, plastic clock. Mesh covered the opening, which featured red, green and yellow wires. The locking mechanism on the box was quite complicated. A smaller box on the collar had a 3-dial combination lock, similar to that found on a luggage padlock. Underneath, there were 4 smaller keyholes, where a metal panel displayed an engraved warning which read, "Do not open, do not remove." There was also a sticker which read the following: "Riveted construction produces deadly shrapnel. Kill zone equals 100 yards, hidden and exposed booby traps." The role of the first responders at the scene was not to try to disarm the bomb, or to try to remove it from Brian's neck. They didn't know what they were dealing with, and they were ill-equipped to do anything at this point. As far as the officers were concerned, any attempt to remove the device could result in detonation. So the decision was made to wait for the bomb squad, while trying to obtain as much information about the situation as possible. This way, the officers would be able to assist the bomb squad, helping them to work as quickly, efficiently, and safely as possible. The area that Brian had been apprehended in was one of the busiest shopping areas in the whole of Erie, and a crowd had started to assemble. The officers were well aware that if Brian was telling the truth about the bomb, then time really was of the essence. The clock was quite literally ticking, and Brian was well aware of this too. Ironically, officers had positioned a roadblock around the area, keeping pedestrians at bay. However, this just made it more difficult for the bomb squad to get to the scene. They were 6 miles away, sitting in heavy traffic, and still needed to collect their equipment as they were off duty when the call came in. A camera crew arrived at the scene and started filming, not knowing how long the standoff would go on for. By this time, local FBI agents, Jerry Clark and Bob Rhodes, had arrived on the scene. Agent Rhodes was the head of the FBI office in Erie, and Agent Clark was very experienced in investigating bank robberies and violent crime. Prior to working for the FBI, Clark worked as a special agent for both the DEA and NCIS. Brian was starting to complain that the bomb around his neck was becoming very heavy and was worried that it could detonate any time soon. He asked the officers if he could stand up, but he was told to stay on the ground. One of the officers even said to Brian, "If this is bullshit, you'd better end it now." But Brian maintained that he was telling the truth. Brian asked if he could smoke a cigarette and see a priest. However, both requests were declined without hesitation. Brian, who was looking incredibly distressed by now, started to plead with officers. "Why isn't anyone trying to get this thing off? I don't have a lot of time." He started to talk about the guy that placed the bomb around his neck. He said he pulled a key out which started a timer. "I heard the thing start ticking when he did. It's gonna go off, I'm not lying. There was an eerie moment of silence as Brian started to shift uncomfortably on the ground. Time felt like it stood still, as everyone froze in shock and panic as the device around Brian's neck started to beep. It was now 3:18 p.m, and Brian had been sitting on the ground with his hands cuffed behind his back for 25 minutes, anxiously awaiting help to arrive. A bead of sweat trickled down Brian's face as he gulped and took a deep breath. He closed his eyes for what must have seemed like an eternity as he started muttering words of prayer to himself under his breath, now resigned to his fate. A deafening boom filled the air as the device finally detonated. Brian was launched backwards by the blast, which opened up a cavity the size of a fist in his chest. He lay on his back, staring at the sky, as he took his final few breaths before passing away. Frustratingly for everyone involved, the bomb squad arrived an agonising 3 minutes after detonation. Thankfully, the TV company was experiencing technical difficulties, so Brian's death wasn't broadcast live. Immediately after Brian's death, a team of officers assembled by the TV tower where Brian claimed he was ambushed by the three men. Tyre track impressions from Brian's car and shoe impressions were lifted from the scene, but no evidence was ever found to support Brian's claim that he was ambushed by anyone. Police officers and the wider community were completely at a loss as to how Brian had ended up having this device locked around his neck. Questions were being raised. Did Brian do this to himself? Was it some kind of suicide mission? Was he lying about the three men? Was this a random attack or some kind of terrorist attack? The next job for police at this point was to search Brian's car for evidence. In Brian's car, police found 9 pages of instructions very similar to those found at the bank. There were also maps and drawings found, which were quite clearly intended to lead Brian on some kind of wild goose chase. A cruel, wicked game that Brian was never intended to win. The PNC Bank was the first of 4 locations on Brian's deadly treasure hunt. However, it was abundantly clear from the notes that Brian had a very limited amount of time. Brian was never intended to find all the keys, and even if he did, the device was never designed to be opened. In essence, Brian's fate was sealed the moment the device was secured around his neck. The FBI, ATF, and police were all involved in collecting and preserving evidence from the blast. This would prove to be a monumental task, as over 150 pieces of evidence were recovered from the scene. These items included a battery, broken shards from a kitchen timer, a toy cell phone, and bone fragments from Brian's neck. The next stage in the investigation was to X-ray the collar itself to ensure that there was no potential for a second explosion. The problem with this was that the device was still locked around Brian's neck. There was no evidence at the time of the autopsy to suggest that there was potential for a second blast, or that the collar remained booby-trapped. Forensics felt that it was very unlikely that there would be a second blast. However, this couldn't be guaranteed. Great consideration needed to be taken when deciding how to remove the device from Brian's body. This left forensic scientists with an incredibly difficult decision to make. At 3 a.m, Brian's body was transported to the coroner's office with the device still locked around his neck. He made the decision to perform a surgical decapitation of Brian's head, in order to preserve the most important piece of evidence, the collar bomb itself. Korak said that the decision to remove Brian's head was the most difficult decision he'd ever had to make, and that the procedure was carried out as carefully and delicately as possible. The day after Brian's death, a warrant was issued to search Brian's house for evidence. Police arrived at 2421 Mill Creek in the early hours of the morning, but they found no evidence to suggest that the device had been manufactured at Brian's property. In fact, to the surprise of investigators, Brian's property was very neat, tidy, and minimalist. That same day, local news outlet, the Erie Times News, sent a team to the clearing where Brian claimed he was attacked. The road had been cordoned off with crime scene tape, but the reporter spotted a large man of around 50 years old standing next to a property located next to the dirt road. The man's name was Bill Rothstein, an unmarried, eccentric handyman who had lived in Erie his whole life. Bill was also a substitute high school workshop teacher, but his true passion in life was electronics. He was very well spoken and seemed completely unconcerned by all of the sudden attention surrounding his property. Bill showed the reporters the way to the clearing via his backyard and was more than willing to cooperate with FBI officers when they knocked on his door. However, Bill denied any knowledge of the bombing, and for now it was left at that. Special Agent Jason Wick was assisting Jerry Clark with the investigation. Agent Wick had accrued a vast amount of experience in all manner of firearms and explosives, having worked on high-profile cases since 1989. These cases included the hijacking of Flight 93 United Airlines on September 11th. Wick would say that the bomb that killed Brian Wells was one of the most complex, improvised explosive devices he'd ever seen. He was quietly relieved that the bomb squad hadn't arrived at the scene on time, because any attempt by bomb technicians to access the inner workings of the bomb to disarm it would most certainly have triggered a detonation and ultimately a far greater loss of life. Despite an extensive search of the blast site and each of the stops on the scavenger hunt, none of the keys were ever found. When police raided Brian's cottage, they found an address book which contained the phone number of a well-known sex worker named Jessica Hoopsick. Brian would frequently pay to spend time with Jessica, who was a 24-year-old drug addict, heavily addicted to crack cocaine. The time that Brian and Jessica spent together wasn't always of a sexual nature. Brian had fallen in love with Jessica and often just wanted to enjoy her company. He would pay for her time either in cash or in crack cocaine, which he would purchase from a mutual friend and local drug dealer, Kenneth Barnes. Almost 1 month after Brian's death, the case was going cold, as police officers were struggling to find any evidence tying anyone to the case. That was until police received a phone call from Bill Rothstein, the man that lived at the property by the area where Brian was allegedly ambushed. Bill told the police that he had information regarding a woman that might be of interest to them. That woman's name was Marjorie Deal Armstrong. Bill told police that he'd helped Marjorie do things that he didn't want to do, but he wanted to make it abundantly clear that he hadn't killed anyone. Bill gave his address to the police officer on the phone and explained to the officer that there was a body in the freezer in his garage. Police quickly realised that this was the same address that they'd been to when searching the dirt road near the TV transmission tower after Brian's death. Marjorie Deal Armstrong was born on February 26th in 1949 in Erie. She had grown up in Erie with hard-working and successful parents. Marjorie was very shy and awkward as a child and never quite seemed normal compared to other children of her age. She grew up to be a very attractive, intelligent young woman, earning herself a master's degree in education, and she was also widely recognised as a musical prodigy. Many men found Marjorie's good looks captivating, and she used this to her advantage, manipulating them, as she knew they would do anything for her. People who knew Marjorie would say that she had a very unhealthy obsession with money from a young age, and she always believed that being an only child meant that one day she would inherit her parents' wealth. Marjorie was incredibly arrogant, with a very overinflated view of herself, often seeing others as being beneath her. Her neighbourhood was largely populated with working-class families, and Marjorie believed that they were all beneath her. She really felt superior to all of them. At the age of 21, Marjorie was introduced to a 26-year-old Bill Rothstein by a mutual friend. Bill was 6'2", a jack of all trades, an electrician, a handyman, and a substitute teacher. He gained a network of friends through his interest in amateur radio photography, community theatre, and computer programming. Bill didn't drink or smoke, but he did have a tendency to lie to people, even telling them that he was a member of Mensa. Bill was very loyal to his friends and had a reputation for being a bit of a joker, but not always the well-meaning kind. He He would often record phone calls which made him feel a sense of power and control by giving him a one-up on people. However, this is illegal in Pennsylvania. He liked to make it difficult for people to track him down, and he could only be found in the phone book under the name William Deschmuck. Over the coming years, Marjorie and Bill would become romantically involved, going roller skating on their first date, becoming inseparable for a while. The couple would get engaged in 1970. However, it wouldn't last long, and they would eventually just settle on a friendship. In 1971, Marjorie began to acknowledge that her mental health was on a decline. It was around this time that she met 29-year-old Vietnam War veteran Bob Thomas. Bob was separated from his wife at the time, but just like Marjorie, he was said to be dealing with his own mental health issues, including schizophrenia and PTSD. In 1972, Marjorie sought medical help for her conditions as an outpatient. She said she was finding it increasingly difficult to trust other people, suffering with anxiety and bouts of extreme paranoia. She eventually received a diagnosis for bipolar disorder, with passive-aggressive personality traits and a deep hatred for men. Marjorie began to accept and even embrace the diagnosis of bipolar disorder. However, she absolutely hated being known as somebody who despised men. Over the coming years, Marjorie worked in secretarial roles, landing herself a position in a counselling centre in Erie, before studying at Gannon College. In 1975, she graduated from Gannon College with a master's degree in education, going on to work as a guidance counsellor. She also gained employment as a substitute American history teacher, as well as being a private music teacher. In 1980, Marjorie founded a non-for-profit organisation called the Erie Women's Centre. She would work here as a fertility counsellor, whilst also facilitating the termination of unwanted pregnancies. This is where Marjorie would first find herself in trouble with the law. She was arrested in Buffalo for attempted theft by deception, for falsely advising a woman that she was pregnant and arranging an appointment for the woman to have a termination, which cost the woman $150. She was initially sentenced to 2 years probation and 60 hours of community service. However, she would manage to strike a deal with the DA, whereby she would accept a position in a rehab program for first-time offenders. Marjorie successfully completed the program, avoiding a criminal conviction in the process. However, Marjorie's role at the Women's Centre would be her last ever position of full-time employment. Marjorie sought the help of a doctor who signed her off work permanently due to her medical conditions. This meant that she was now eligible to receive disability benefits, food from food banks, and public housing. At this time, Marjorie was still in a relationship with Armed Forces veteran Bob Thomas. The relationship between the couple had turned volatile and violent. In 1984, Marjorie met a woman called Donna at one of the food banks. The pair stayed in contact, and Donna began to confide in Marjorie about the state of her own relationship, in which she claimed she was being mentally, physically, and sexually abused by her partner. Marjorie said that she identified and sympathised with Donna's situation, being in a similar relationship with her own partner, Bob Thomas. Marjorie started taking more than her entitlement from the food banks, stockpiling everything that she didn't use, and she discussed plans with Donna to sell the surplus food items. Fairly common for food bank recipients to double dip and sell what they didn't use. Donna gave Marjorie her contact details, telling her that she could contact her if ever she needed anything. However, she didn't really believe that she'd hear from Marjorie again. So it was a huge surprise to Donna when one day Marjorie would turn up at her door with 2 bags of items of clothing and documents. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. Marjorie confided in Donna that she'd shot and killed her boyfriend Bob Thomas, offering Donna $25,000 to assist her in disposing of Bob's body. Initially, Donna thought that this was some kind of joke. That was until Marjorie revealed $18,000 in cash in one of the bags, and she began to explain in detail why and how she'd killed Bob Thomas. Understandably scared and shaken by this revelation, Donna made a phone call to her sister, Susan. Marjorie offered the same amount of money to Susan as she did to Donna. However, Susan was mortified and politely declined the offer. The sisters wanted absolutely nothing to do with Marjorie's plans, so they fled from her as quickly as they possibly could. They made a phone call to their mother, who wasted no time at all in contacting the police and reporting Marjorie for the murder. Marjorie was arrested by police later that day, but claimed that she had shot Bob entirely in self-defense. When officers from the county health department arrived at Marjorie's property, they were shocked and appalled at what they found. Marjorie's house was completely overflowing with clutter and mess. Dirty plates and bowls, boxes of leftover food were scattered all over the kitchen. The cupboards, refrigerator, freezers were all jam-packed full with food items. The spare bedroom was void of any furniture, but was full to the brim with clothes, books, magazines, papers, and over 600 coat hangers. There were piles of papers relating to mental illness, suggesting that Marjorie had been doing her research on her mental illnesses. There was a foul stench of rotting food coming from the cupboards and the attic. It was so bad that officers were reluctant to even enter Marjorie's property, which was also swarming with rats. It turned out that Marjorie had been turning up at the food banks with fraudulent notes, claiming that she had been granted permission to collect food items on behalf of other individuals. 4 tons of food was disposed of from Marjorie's house, because it was deemed a health risk. The total value of all the food destroyed was estimated at just under $10,000. Bob Thomas's body was found with 6 gunshot wounds, all from close range. His body was found with his right side on the couch, his feet on the floor, and his head on the armrest. Marjorie's legal team elected to pursue a defence that Marjorie was incompetent to stand trial due to her mental illnesses. However, her legal team soon realised that Marjorie felt she was of superior intelligence to them. She was being incredibly difficult to cooperate with. Between 1984 and 1987, Marjorie underwent 4 separate psychiatric evaluations, all of which concluded that she was indeed unfit to stand trial. She was ordered to undergo state hospital medical evaluations every 90 days, and continued to blame anybody but herself for the things that had gone wrong in her life up to this point. In late January 1988, Marjorie was eventually deemed fit to stand trial for first-degree murder. After standing trial for 10 days, the jury came to the conclusion that Marjorie was not guilty of murder, but that she was guilty of possessing a firearm without a licence, for which she was sentenced to 15 months probation. After her acquittal, Marjorie went on to form a romantic relationship with a man called Richard Armstrong. They shared many common interests, which include music and psychology. However, they both had a criminal history, and just like Marjorie's previous relationship, this relationship too was volatile and dysfunctional. Richard was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and obsessive-compulsive disorder, which made it virtually impossible to hold down a job. During an intense argument, Richard started throwing bricks at Marjorie through an open door, injuring her leg. He even threatened to kill Marjorie and set her car on fire. Richard would serve a maximum sentence of 12 months after being convicted of assault for the attack. However, the couple would remain in the relationship until Richard would die under questionable circumstances. Richard died in hospital of a stroke 2 days after tripping and smashing his head on the corner of a coffee table. Marjorie seemed both devastated and vengeful about losing Richard, and she wanted to hold somebody accountable. She soon filed a lawsuit for malpractice against the health centre that Richard had been in, claiming that they had failed to diagnose his condition properly. Marjorie received $250,000 in compensation and paid $75,000 in legal fees, leaving her with $175,000, which was more money than she'd ever had. Despite this, she strongly believed that she should have received a lot more from the settlement. Marjorie spent the next 10 years of her life, up to 2003, with a man called Jim Roden. She would often berate Jim, putting him down and comparing him to her ex-partner Richard. She would tell Jim that their relationship would never live up to what she had with Richard. This relationship followed the same pattern as all of Marjorie's previous relationships: violence, abuse, restraining orders, and prison sentences. Marjorie had now been diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, in addition to her existing conditions. After Marjorie's mother passed away, she battled with her father for administration of the estate and her savings. Marjorie's parents had always been financially savvy, frugal spenders and diligent savers, amassing a combined marital estate of $1.8 million. Marjorie failed in her attempt to wrestle the estate from her father, fueling an obsession with getting her own back on him. She also felt aggrieved by the PNC Bank for not granting her access to her mother's fortune. It was around about this time that Marjorie and Jim made a connection with local drug dealer Kenneth Barnes. As already mentioned, Ken Barnes was a local drug dealer, property landlord, handyman, and TV repairman. All in all, Ken Barnes was bad news. He was a lowlife that lived in squalor, renting rooms out to sex workers and selling crack cocaine. One of the sex workers that rented a room from Ken Barnes was the aforementioned Jessica Hoopsick. Which brings us back to Brian Wells. Brian and Jessica would spend time together at Ken's property. Meanwhile, Ken was spending a lot of time around at Marjorie and Jim's place, where he would often see Brian delivering pizzas. In June of 2003, Marjorie and Jim were travelling around Erie in Marjorie's car when the car broke down. Marjorie contacted the one person she'd always been able to depend on in these situations, her ex-fiancé, Bill Rothstein. Marjorie and Bill remained friends and continued to see each other on and off throughout the years. Although Bill always confessed his love for Marjorie never committed to him again after their failed engagement years before. A few weeks after the car incident, Marjorie reported a break-in at her property, where she claimed that a few $1,000s had been stolen. After the alleged break-in, Marjorie made the decision to purchase a 12-gauge shotgun from an advert she saw in a local newspaper. The seller reported that when Marjorie turned up to purchase the shotgun, she smelled really strongly of cat urine, looked dishevelled and anxious, and totally exhausted. Marjorie paid for the shotgun mostly in $20 bills and claimed that she needed it for self-protection after the break-in. However, it's what happened not long after she purchased the shotgun that gave Bill Rothstein a reason to call the police. Bill Rothstein had been hiding a dark secret. On September 20th, less than a month after the death of Brian Wells, Bill Rothstein would make a phone call to police to report that dark secret. He told the operator on the phone that at 8645 Peach Street, in the garage, there is a frozen body. It's in the freezer. When asked by the operator how he knew this to be true, Rothstein responded, "Because I live there." During an interrogation by the police the following day, Rothstein would make the following revelation to the officers. He said basically, the person that I had known since the 60s or 70s had a body in her house she wanted to remove. I helped her remove it. I put it basically in my garage. That Saturday, she wanted to completely destroy it. I called the state police because I did not want anything to do with that. Also, I was fearful of what would happen to me should she find that out. Or should I refuse to do that? It was when Marjorie declared to Rothstein that she wanted him to assist her in disposing of the body by means of an ice grinding machine that he realised that he couldn't go through with it. He had to come clean to the police. After purchasing the shotgun, Marjorie returned home to find her boyfriend Jim Roden fast asleep, face down in bed. She proceeded to blast him twice in the back with the shotgun and left him lying there for 2 days before turning up at Bill's place to ask him for help, telling him what she'd done. Marjorie paid Bill $78,000 to help her dispose of Jim's body. On September 21st, police turned up at Bill Rothstein's place to find Marjorie. On September 21st, police arrived at Bill Rothstein's place, where they found Marjorie and arrested her on suspicion of homicide, aggravated assault, possession of an instrument of crime, tampering with evidence, criminal conspiracy to tamper with evidence, and abuse of a corpse. Given her acquittal for the murder of her previous partner Bob Thomas back in 1984, things weren't looking good for Marjorie. Whilst in custody, Bill Rothstein informed police about a suicide letter he had written before he came forward to the police. The letter read, "My body is in the bedroom on the first floor. 1. This has nothing to do with the Brian Wells case. 2. The body in the freezer is Jim Roden. 3. I did not kill him or participate in his death." Bill told the police about the letter in an attempt to prove to them that he had nothing to do with the murder of Jim Roden. However, the letter opened up a whole can of worms. Up until this point, police were struggling for leads with regards to the Brian Wells case. No connection had been made between the death of Jim Roden and what happened to Brian Wells. There seemed to be no reason for Bill Rothstein to even mention Brian Wells in this letter, unless he had some involvement in the collar bombing. During the investigation, police found out that Rothstein had a man called Floyd Stockton living at his property at the time of the Brian Wells case. Stockton was a fugitive and convicted rapist. He was on the run from the police for the rape of a disabled teenage girl in Washington the year before. He had also spent 10 years in prison for a previous rape charge. Floyd was taken in for questioning by the FBI, but denied any involvement in Jim Roden's murder. In fact, he claimed he didn't even know that there was a body in the freezer. Floyd passed the polygraph test, which cleared him of any involvement in the Brian Wells case and the Jim Roden murder. He pleaded guilty to the rape charge and was sentenced to just 2 years in prison in Washington. Behind the scenes, the collar bomb task force was starting to connect the dots between the Jim Roden murder and the Brian Wells case. During the police interview, officers asked Bill Rothstein what he knew about a second man that worked with Brian Wells at the pizza shop. Robert Panetti was a friend and colleague of Brian Wells. He was the only other pizza delivery driver at Mamma Mia's. Robert had also been brought in for questioning following the death of Brian Wells. He was seeking any sort of legal protection as he felt that police were connecting him to the death of Brian Wells. According to Floyd Stockton and Kenneth Barnes, Robert Panetti was involved in the plans for the collar bomb. They said that he was even present for a dress rehearsal the day before Brian's death. Whether or not Robert was involved in some capacity remains unclear, because on August 31st, just 3 days after the collar bombing, Robert was found dead at home by his family members. Robert's death was initially treated as suspicious by police, but it was later confirmed that he'd died of a drug overdose. It's been speculated that Robert committed suicide through fear of being found guilty of some level of involvement in Brian's death. Bill Rothstein was still denying any knowledge of what had happened to Brian Wells, and even denied knowing Robert Panetti. Bill told police that at the time of the collar bombing, he and Marjorie were wine tasting at vineyards east of Lake Erie, and that he dropped her at Walmart at 7:30 p.m. It's what Bill said to the officers next that really started alarm bells ringing. Bill said that after he dropped Marjorie at Walmart, he may have used the payphone outside the Shell gas station on Peach Street. This was a strange admission to make, as Bill continued to deny any knowledge or involvement in the Wells case. This was a strange admission to make, because that was the very payphone that was used to order the pizzas that Brian would deliver, ultimately leading to his death. After the interview, Bill was charged with abuse of a corpse, conspiring to abuse a corpse, tampering with evidence, and conspiring to tamper with evidence. All of these charges related to the Jim Roden murder. On January 20th, 2004, the preliminary hearing commenced for the Jim Roden case, where the main witness against Marjorie Dale Armstrong was Bill Rothstein. Bill testified that he had willingly accepted payment from Marjorie to transport and store Jim Roden's body and dispose of the murder weapon. Bill also testified that Marjorie had killed Jim out of anger for failing to react when her property was broken into. He said that Marjorie wanted to dispose of Jim's body by means of an ice crusher and meat grinder, and that he just couldn't see himself cutting up a body like that after Marjorie had indicated that she wanted him to do it. Bill said that in helping Marjorie this one last time, he felt like he was helping her to turn a corner in her life. Bill also said that he was worried that if he didn't help her, then he could be next. During the preliminary hearing, Marjorie didn't say a word in her defence. Her legal team requested that she underwent a mental assessment to determine whether or not she was competent to stand trial. Marjorie was ordered into 6 months of psychiatric evaluation as an inpatient at the state hospital. This meant that she was officially incapable of consenting to police interviews. Meanwhile, Bill Rothstein continued to deny his and Marjorie's involvement in the collar bombing. It's evident that Bill was protecting Marjorie as much as he possibly could, more than likely because he was still in love with her on some level. As time went on, Bill Rothstein became unwell, growing weaker and weaker by the day. On 23rd of July 2004, Rothstein was admitted to the Mill Creek Community Hospital with a previous diagnosis of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma showing diffuse, large cell type myeloproliferative lymphoma. Having been put under hospice care with his body riddled with tumours, Bill Rothstein would pass away in hospital just 1 week later, on July 30th at the age of 60. In January 2005, in Erie County Court, Marjorie was placed on trial for the murder of Jim Roden. She pleaded guilty but mentally ill, so she received a sentence of between 7 and 20 years. During this time, the investigation into the collar bomb case continued. Floyd Stockton, despite his criminal convictions, was granted immunity in exchange for a testimony against Marjorie. Kenneth Barnes, who was once Marjorie's friend, fishing companion, and drug dealer, revealed everything he knew about the collar bombing incident and everything that he knew about Brian Wells. The incentive behind Barnes' involvement in the collar bombing was entirely financial. As for Marjorie, her motivation for devising the whole collar bomb plan was also entirely financial. Still reeling at not receiving any money following her mother's death, and very quickly running out of her own money, she devised a plan to get revenge on her father and get her hands on his fortune. Marjorie's plan was to hire a hitman to assassinate her father so that she could gain inheritance from his death. She anticipated that she'd be receiving somewhere in the region of $2 million. So Marjorie approached the one man that she felt might be willing and capable of carrying out such a task, her very own drug dealer, Kenneth Barnes. Barnes was reluctant to carry out the murder at first, but eventually they negotiated a fee of around $200,000 up front for Barnes to assassinate Marjorie's father. The problem was, Marjorie didn't have $200,000. In fact, Marjorie didn't have any money at all. And so she decided the quickest and easiest way to raise $200,000 was to rob a bank. Or even better, trick someone else into committing the crime for her. Conversations and discussions were had between Marjorie, Bill Rothstein, and Kenneth Barnes about who they might be able to convince to carry out something as risky as a bank robbery. Kenneth Barnes approached Jessica Hoopsick because he knew that in her line of work, she must come into contact with desperate men every day. Of course, Jessica did know a man who was naive enough to go ahead with the plan. She knew him very well. That man was Brian Wells. There were two theories as to how Marjorie convinced Brian to go ahead with the plan. The first theory is that Brian was just an innocent victim, in the wrong place at the wrong time, and was forced into committing the robbery by having the bomb locked around his neck, probably at gunpoint. The second and most probable theory, when all evidence is considered, is that Brian Wells was probably in on the plan the whole time. Brian was in debt to Kenneth Barnes for drugs that he'd purchased to pay for the services of Jessica Hoopsick, and so he needed to raise some money. It's been reported that Brian attended a dress rehearsal the day before the incident and was more than willing to go ahead with the plan and carry out the heist. However, Brian was under the impression that the bomb was a fake. He thought that he'd carry out the heist, collect the money, collect the keys, remove the device, and get paid at the end. We now know that that was never the intention. Brian was never supposed to come out of this alive. The way Brian was behaving in the bank, his whole demeanour, casually walking in with his walking stick and walking back out with the lollipop in his mouth, shows that he never really felt like he was under any real risk. Brian never seemed to suspect that the bomb was real until he was on the floor surrounded by police and he heard the device start beeping. At this point, Brian probably realised that he'd been double-crossed and that his fate was sealed. Marjorie wasn't giving anything away to the police. She was a master manipulator, and if the police were going to get anything at all out of Marjorie, she would most certainly want something in return. Marjorie's downfall was her traits of narcissistic personality disorder. During her time in prison, Marjorie would brag about her crimes to her fellow inmates. This is never a wise move when the people you're disclosing information to are looking for leverage to get their own sentences reduced. Naturally, her fellow inmates would relay the information they'd received to the authorities. Police discovered that it was in fact Bill Rothstein who had researched and manufactured the device, and that Floyd Stockton was definitely present on the day. Marjorie was, of course, the brains behind the whole operation. It was her that came up with the whole idea for the scavenger hunt. The problem the police faced at this point was that it was Marjorie's word against her fellow inmates. Although Marjorie had confessed her crimes to her inmates, there was still insufficient evidence to convict Marjorie of Brian Wells' murder. In fact, because Marjorie claimed that Brian Wells was complicit with the whole scheme, and all evidence pointed towards this being the case, nobody was ever charged for his murder. Marjorie was already serving a life sentence for the murder of Jim Roden and for her role in the pizza bombing. However, she wouldn't remain in prison for very long at all. Marjorie Deal Armstrong was diagnosed with terminal breast cancer while serving time in prison. She would pass away at the age of 68 on April 4, 2017, at the Federal Medical Center in Carswell, near Texas. Kenneth Barnes would pass away in prison on June 20, 2019 due to complications with his diabetes. And finally, Floyd Stockton, who was granted immunity following his testimony against Marjorie, would pass away in 2022 on August 10th in Washington. The cause of his death was acute respiratory failure. And that brings us to the end of the story. What do you think? Do you think Brian Wells was in on the plan the whole time? Or do you think he was entirely a victim and completely innocent? Please discuss your thoughts in the comment section down below. Don't forget to tap the like button, hit the notification bell, and subscribe to this channel for a feast of grim and grisly content. I've been your host, Severed Soul. Bill also testified that Marjorie had killed Jim out of anger for failing to react when her property was broken into. He said that Marjorie wanted to dispose of Jim's body by means of an ice crusher and meat grinder, and that he just couldn't see himself cutting up a body like that after Marjorie had indicated that she wanted him to do it. Bill said that in helping Marjorie this one last time, he felt like he was helping her to turn a corner in her life. Bill also said that he was worried that if he didn't help her, then he could be next. During the preliminary hearing, Marjorie didn't say a word in her defence. Her legal team requested that she underwent a mental assessment to determine whether or not she was competent to stand trial. Marjorie was ordered into 6 months of psychiatric evaluation as an inpatient at the state hospital. This meant that she was officially incapable of consenting to police interviews. Meanwhile, Bill Rothstein continued to deny his and Marjorie's involvement in the collar bombing. It's evident that Bill was protecting Marjorie as much as he possibly could. more than likely because he was still in love with her on some level. As time went on, Bill Rothstein became unwell, growing weaker and weaker by the day. On 23rd of July 2004, Rothstein was admitted to the Mill Creek Community Hospital with a previous diagnosis of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma showing diffuse, large cell type myeloproliferative lymphoma. Having been put under hospice care with his body riddled with tumours, Bill Rothstein would pass away in hospital just 1 week later, on July 30th at the age of 60. In January 2005, in Erie County Court, Marjorie was placed on trial for the murder of Jim Roden. She pleaded guilty but mentally ill, so she received a sentence of between 7 and 20 years. During this time, the investigation into the collar bomb case continued. Floyd Stockton, despite his criminal convictions, was granted immunity in exchange for a testimony against Marjorie. Kenneth Barnes, who was once Marjorie's friend, fishing companion, and drug dealer, revealed everything he knew about the collar bombing incident and everything that he knew about Brian Wells. The incentive behind Barnes' involvement in the collar bombing was entirely financial. As for Marjorie, her motivation for devising the whole collar bomb plan was also entirely financial. Still reeling at not receiving any money following her mother's death, and very quickly running out of her own money, she devised a plan to get revenge on her father and get her hands on his fortune. Marjorie's plan was to hire a hitman to assassinate her father so that she could gain inheritance from his death. She anticipated that she'd be receiving somewhere in the region of $2 million. So Marjorie approached the one man that she felt might be willing and capable of carrying out such a task, her very own drug dealer, Kenneth Barnes. Barnes was reluctant to carry out the murder at first, but eventually they negotiated a fee of around $200,000 up front for Barnes to assassinate Marjorie's father. The problem was, Marjorie didn't have $200,000. In fact, Marjorie didn't have any money at all. And so she decided the quickest and easiest way to raise $200,000 was to rob a bank. Or even better, trick someone else into committing the crime for her. Conversations and discussions were had between Marjorie, Bill Rothstein, and Kenneth Barnes about who they might be able to convince to carry out something as risky as a bank robbery. Kenneth Barnes approached Jessica Hoopsick because he knew that in her line of work, she must come into contact with desperate men every day. Of course, Jessica did know a man who was naive enough to go ahead with the plan. She knew him very well. That man was Brian Wells. There were two theories as to how Marjorie convinced Brian to go ahead with the plan. The first theory is that Brian was just an innocent victim, in the wrong place at the wrong time, and was forced into committing the robbery by having the bomb locked around his neck, probably at gunpoint. The second and most probable theory, when all evidence is considered, is that Brian Wells was probably in on the plan the whole time. Brian was in debt to Kenneth Barnes for drugs that he'd purchased to pay for the services of Jessica Hoopsick, and so he needed to raise some money. It's been reported that Brian attended a dress rehearsal the day before the incident and was more than willing to go ahead with the plan and carry out the heist. However, Brian was under the impression that the bomb was a fake. He thought that he'd carry out the heist, collect the money, collect the keys, remove the device, and get paid at the end. We now know that that was never the intention. Brian was never supposed to come out of this alive. The way Brian was behaving in the bank, his whole demeanour, casually walking in with his walking stick and walking back out with a lollipop in his mouth, shows that he never really felt like he was under any real risk. Brian never seemed to suspect that the bomb was real until he was on the floor surrounded by police and he heard the device start beeping. At this point, Brian probably realised that he'd been double-crossed and that his fate was sealed. Marjorie wasn't giving anything away to the police. She was a master manipulator, and if the police were going to get anything at all out of Marjorie, she would most certainly want something in return. Marjorie's downfall was her traits of narcissistic personality disorder. During her time in prison, Marjorie would brag about her crimes to her fellow inmates. This is never a wise move when the people you're disclosing information to are looking for leverage to get their own sentences reduced. Naturally, her fellow inmates would relay the information they'd received to the authorities. Police discovered that it was in fact Bill Rothstein who had researched and manufactured the device, and that Floyd Stockton was definitely present on the day. Marjorie was, of course, the brains behind the whole operation. It was her that came up with the whole idea for the scavenger hunt. The problem the police faced at this point was that it was Marjorie's word against her fellow inmates. Although Marjorie had confessed her crimes to her inmates, there was still insufficient evidence to convict Marjorie of Brian Wells' murder. In fact, because Marjorie claimed that Brian Wells was complicit with the whole scheme, and all evidence pointed towards this being the case, nobody was ever charged for his murder. Marjorie was already serving a life sentence for the murder of Jim Roden and for her role in the pizza bombing. However, she wouldn't remain in prison for very long at all. Marjorie Deal Armstrong was diagnosed with terminal breast cancer while serving time in prison. She would pass away at the age of 68 on April 4, 2017, at the Federal Medical Center in Carswell, near Texas. Kenneth Barnes would pass away in prison on June 20, 2019 due to complications with his diabetes. And finally, Floyd Stockton, who was granted immunity following his testimony against Marjorie, would pass away in 2022 on August 10th in Washington. The cause of his death was acute respiratory failure. And that brings us to the end of the story. What do you think? Do you think Brian Wells was in on the plan the whole time? Or do you think he was entirely a victim and completely innocent? Please discuss your thoughts in the comment section down below. Don't forget to tap the like button, hit the notification bell, and subscribe to this channel for a feast of grim and grisly content. I've been your host, Severed Soul.